We began to address a question yesterday on whether or not God can be proud of us. And I believe that is simply a bad terminology. Perhaps somebody is misunderstanding what God would have of us. So let's go to the positive side. Let's go to what Scripture has to say that we should be trying to do. And so there's several passages I'd like to draw to your attention. First of all, we should be living our lives to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. It's a rather all-encompassing statement. There's a context here of the eating and drinking and so forth of the Corinthians. But the point is, everything we do, no matter what it is, should be done for the glory of God. So we're living not for God to say, I'm proud of you, but we're living to glorify Him. But it's a different, whole different switch here, because to say that God is proud of us puts the spotlight on us. It draws the attention to us. But if we're living for the glory of God, the spotlight goes on God. And so our goal is to glorify Him. To glorify is, in this way, is to showcase His greatness, to showcase His splendor, to live in such a way that the world sees through us the true glory and the magnificence of God Himself. That should be the goal of every Christian. That's the overall purpose, I believe, of our life on earth. And whatever we do, whether it's going to work, whether it's driving our car, whether it's raising our children, whether it's going to church, whether it's reading our Bible, whatever we're doing, whether it's seemingly secular or seemingly sacred, there's no division there. Everything we do is to be done for the glory of God. Now, another way of saying something similar, I think, is found over in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 9. Paul is talking here about the life beyond death and what happens at that point. And by verse 10 of chapter 5, he's talking about what we call the judgment seat of Christ, where the day will come when the Lord will examine our deeds, whether good or evil, for Him, good or bad, and there is reward for those good deeds that we have done. But verse 9 is not a throwaway. It's a very important verse. Therefore, we also have as our ambition, whether at home, that is alive, or absent, that is speaking in this context of death, to be pleasing to Him. So that's very similar to what we just saw on the glory of God, but is said a little differently and perhaps a little plainer, more clear to us to realize that we are to live our life to please God. So whatever we're doing in this life or the next, whether once again it's sacred or secular, as we understand it, all that should be done to please Him. I want to please God. I want to please Him. I want to go down the road that honors Him and glorifies Him and pleases Him. And another passage of Scripture that we could look at here concerns the issue of this pleasing Him, and that's over in Hebrews chapter 11, which actually talks about God's approval. In 11:6, it says this concerning God's approval. He says, without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he who draws near to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. So let's stay for a moment with pleasing God. How do you please God? Well, this whole passage is dedicated to the proposition that we please God through faith. We can do all sorts of good works and all sorts of good things, but they could be done in wrong ways. But when we're trusting God, when we have faith in God, it says here that we can please Him. And without faith, it's impossible to please Him. Now back up to verse 2. He's speaking of men and women of faith of the Old Testament. He said, for by it the men of old gained approval, by faith. They gained approval. How did they receive the approval of God? By living faithful life. In verse 39, he says, and all of these, after he's indexed all of these different ones in the Old Testament who lived by faith, he said, all of these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. So they all gained approval, once again, through faith. So he begins this chapter by saying they gained approval by faith. He speaks in verse 6 about pleasing God by faith. He ends the chapter by talking about gaining approval from God through faith. So how do you think we gain the approval of God? By faith, of course. And so those that live in trust of God, believing God, even when things seem to be totally impossible, for such people, they win the approval of God. God approves of the life they're living, not because they're always perfect by any means, but because they trust Him. They live by faith.